Islam in the West.
Although estimates of the number of American Muslims vary from 4 to 12 million, there are at least 6 million, making Islam the third largest religion after Christianity and Judaism in America. And in Europe, the approximately 15 million Muslims make Islam the second largest religion. Many believe that in the first half of the 21st century, Islam will become the second largest religion in America. So Islam is very much in the West. Historically, Muslims were present in America before the 19th century. The explorers, traders, and settlers who visited the New World from the time of Columbus included Moriscos, Spanish Muslims who hid their Muslim faith. They migrated to both Spanish and Portuguese settlements in America. Between 14 and 20% of the African slaves brought to America between the 16th and the 19th centuries were Muslim, although they were forced to convert to Christianity. Indians and Arabs who were not slaves also immigrated during this period and maintained their spiritual, cultural, and social identity. The numbers of Muslims in America increased in the late 19th century. Significant numbers of immigrants from the Arab world, places like Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, settled in the Midwest and Canada as blue-collar workers and assimilated into American society. After World War II, large numbers of immigrants from Palestine who had lost their homes after the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, as well as elites from the Middle East and South Asia and other places seeking higher education or professional advancement came to America. In recent decades, many students from the Muslim world have come to study, and many well-educated professionals and intellectuals have emigrated from South and Southeast Asia, as well as from the Middle East and parts of Africa, for political and economic reasons. About 2/3 of the Muslims in America today are immigrants or the descendants of immigrants. The other third is indigenous, made up of African Americans, many African American converts to Islam, along with smaller numbers, but a significant number of white American converts, and more recently, Hispanic Muslims. The largest Muslim communities in the United States are in cities like Boston, New York, Detroit, Dearborn, Toledo, Chicago, Houston, Los Angeles. As compared to 30 years ago, when I first began to study Islam, and Islam was invisible on our landscape, in many of not only these major cities, but many rural areas, you will find today mosques and Islamic centers. Like most Americans, Muslims in America are diverse. We sometimes forget this. We'll say, are there 6 or 8 million Muslims? And the presumption will be that they are all religiously observant, for example. Whereas we don't make that same presumption when we talk about the numbers of Jews or Christians. So Muslims in America are diverse. They're secular and religious, observant and non-observant, liberal, conservative, fundamentalist, Democrat and Republican. African American Islam emerged in the early 20th century when a number of black Americans converted to Islam. The religion they believed was part of their original African identity, preferred over Christianity, which was seen as a religion of white supremacy and oppression, the slaveholders' religion, as it were. In the early 1930s, Wallace D. Fard Muhammad, called the Great Mahdi, drew on the Quran and the Bible, to preach black liberation and build the nation of Islam in the ghettos of Detroit. When he mysteriously disappeared in 1934, Elijah Muhammad, who lived from 1897 to 1975, took over and built what was called the Nation of Islam into an effective national movement whose members became known as Black Muslims. Elijah Muhammad denounced white society's political and economic oppression of blacks and its results, self-hatred, poverty, and dependency, and taught self-improvement and empowerment. By the 1970s, his Nation of Islam had more than 100,000 members. Many black Muslim movement beliefs at that time differed from mainstream Islam. And the nation, for example, did not follow the 5 pillars of Islam or observe major Muslim rituals. A number of basic beliefs in the black Muslim movement differed significantly from mainstream Islam. Black separatism. Remember the notion of the Ummah. The community of Muslims transcends race, tribe, nation. Elijah Muhammad announced that Wallace D. Fard was Allah, which would go directly against mainstream Islamic thought. And thus that God was a black man, and that he, Elijah Muhammad, not the Prophet Muhammad, was the last messenger of God. The nation taught black supremacy and black separatism, not Islam's brotherhood. That brotherhood that transcends, as I said earlier, racial, tribal, and ethnic differences. A prominent figure that emerged, an almost charismatic leader, was Malcolm X. He took the X meaning ex-smoker, ex-drinker, ex-Christian, and ex-slave. Malcolm gained prominence in the Nation of Islam. However, in 1964, he started his own organization and went on pilgrimage to Mecca, returning as El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, a mainstream Muslim. On February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated as he spoke to an audience in New York City. 2 members of the Nation of Islam were convicted of the murder. In the 1960s, the sons of Elijah Muhammad challenged their father's teachings and strategies. Near the end of his life, Elijah Muhammad also himself made the pilgrimage to Mecca and began to modify some of his teachings. One of his sons, Wallace D. Muhammad, succeeded the father as supreme minister of the Nation of Islam and implemented major reforms. He revised doctrines and organizational structure so that they conformed to the teachings of orthodox, or again, mainstream Sunni Islam. Wallace Fard was thus identified now as the founder of the nation, and Elijah Muhammad as the leader who brought black Americans to his interpretation of Islam. Wallace Muhammad made the pilgrimage to Mecca and encouraged his followers to study Arabic in order to better understand Islam. Temples, and the Nation of Islam had called its places of meeting or worship temples, were renamed mosques, and their leaders were now called imams, leaders. Not the imam in the sense of the imam in Shia Islam, but the generic term imam, which just means leader, which is used in Islam for a leader, a religious leader, particularly one who leads the prayer, and often the person who, for example, runs or supervises the mosque. But anyone who leads the prayer can be called the imam, the leader of the prayer. So now they came to be called imams rather than ministers. The community observed the 5 pillars of Islam in union with the worldwide Islamic community to which they now belong. Black separatist doctrines were dropped as the nation community began to participate within the American political process. Finally, the equality of male and female members was reaffirmed, and women were given more responsible positions in the ministry of the community. While the nation continued to work for social and economic change, business ventures were cut back and religious identity and mission were given greater priority. At the end of the 1970s, Wallace transferred organizational leadership to an elected council of 6 imams, or leaders, and focused on his own role as primarily a religious and spiritual leader. In the mid-1980s, signaling his and the nation's new religious identity and mission, Wallace changed his name to Warith Deen Muhammad and renamed the community the American Muslim Mission, integrating it within the global mainstream Islamic community and within the American Muslim community, remembering that community is made up of both immigrant and indigenous. Media coverage of the black Muslim movement often focuses on Louis Farrakhan, who led a minority of nation members in protest against Warith's reforms. In recent years, Farrakhan, who then became the leader of and retained the notion of the Nation of Islam, with many of the trappings, leaders called ministers, etc., Farrakhan himself moved away from some of his earlier black separatist doctrines, or claimed to move away, and his anti-Semitic statements, and has moved the nation closer to more orthodox Islamic practices, maintaining a desire for a closer identity with mainstream Islam. The problems the growing Muslim community faces in America start with the fact that only a few decades ago, Muslims were mostly invisible in the West. Their visibility then emerged by association often with the militant nation of Islam, or conflicts such as the Iranian Revolution, hijackings and hostage-taking in the Middle East and South Asia. Some saw these events as signs of an Islamic threat or a clash of civilization, Islam versus the West. America's relationship with Muslims was seen within a context of conflict and confrontation. Islam was viewed as a foreign religion, distinct from the Judeo-Christian tradition, rather than the notion of children of Abraham. This reinforced the sense of us and them. Subsequent attacks against America and Americans in Somalia, Saudi Arabia, Africa in the late 1990s, and most recently in New York and Washington on 9/11, have led many to regard Islam and Muslims with fear and distrust. They judge Islam as inherently violent and militant, religiously and culturally. This has an impact on the status and role of Muslims. Like many other immigrants of diverse religious and ethnic backgrounds, Muslims have been challenged to define their place in America and European society. Like Jews and Catholics before them, they struggle with assimilation, integration, multiculturalism, intermarriage, gender relations, worship and education, a whole host of issues. Some struggle with the English language, as new immigrants do, as well as holding on to their native or homeland cultures. How much of the old culture should one hold on to? And many face religious and ethnic discrimination in the workplace and in society. Like Jewish law for Jews, as I noted earlier, Islamic law is central to a Muslim's life, covering religious requirements, dietary regulations, and family law. And so for Muslims living as minorities in America and Europe, the question is, how does one then bring this along, fit it into the new environment, into the new culture, into the new society? Ironically, many of the non-Muslim minorities who preceded them and made it in America do not identify with Muslims and fail to see the similarities between their own past and Muslims' current problems. It was disheartening to me at one point to see after 9/11 the owner of a gas station, who from his name looked like he was Italian-American, saying, send them all back to where they came from. And I kept thinking, being Italian-American, this guy probably is second generation. And suddenly he acts as if he was always here, as if he were a Native American Indian or came over on the Mayflower. And has suddenly fallen into an us and them mentality. Oftentimes, Muslims fall outside the circle, therefore, of American pluralism. That is, the comfortable circle. Because they are not part of the Judeo-Christian or even, in a sense, secular culture, that perception. However different previous religious and ethnic minorities, the vast majority were Judeo-Christian. Most regard Islam or have regarded Islam as foreign. Few have thought of it as an Abrahamic religion, as part of a Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. In the absence of this knowledge and awareness, Islam is often seen through explosive headline events. And thus, as I've said before, the hatred and violence of a minority of religious extremists obscure the faith of the mainstream majority. In recent years, a major issue for Muslims has been the Americanization of the Muslim experience. Because imams coming from foreign countries are not always aware of or sensitive to the problems that American Muslims encounter, the training of native imams or indigenous imams has been seriously undertaken since the 1980s. Legal councils addressing life in America and the issues of life in America have been founded to respond to questions raised by communities here in America, rather than always relying on scholars overseas to provide the norm or interpret the norm for today, although that continues to exist as well. Muslims do participate today increasingly in interfaith activities with Jews and Christians, both at the national level, the international level, but also at the local level. A host of national and international organizations have been created to monitor and promote Muslim causes and Muslim interests, much as other ethnic and religious groups have done the same before them. Despite problems, however, Muslims long regarded as other are now part of the fabric of our society, as neighbors, as co-workers, as citizens, as co-believers. I often give the example of, at one point, my wife had an accident. We needed to rush her to the hospital at Georgetown. Unfortunately, it proved not to be super serious. But the first physicians that we encountered at Georgetown Hospital were a Saudi resident, an Iranian American. So the first two physicians were from the Muslim world, indicating the beginning of that change. Muslims have increasingly become more integrated into the American political process, both as individuals and organizationally. Now, the situation in Western Europe is somewhat the same, somewhat different. Estimates of the number of Muslims living in Western Europe range from 12 to 15 million, but I'll work with the 15 million figure. The ethnic diversity of Muslims in Europe represents most of the major ethnic groups of the Muslim world. Remember, a key factor here too is that Europe was a major colonial power, and so many people from the colonies then came to European countries after independence and since the time of independence. Most numerous are Turks, Algerians, Moroccans, Pakistanis. Because of this great diversity, despite a common religious bond, it is difficult to speak of a homogeneous Muslim community in any individual country, let alone across Europe. Muslims may be found in significant numbers in most Western European countries. The largest Muslim populations are in France, approximately 5 million, Germany, approximately 3.2 million, and the United Kingdom, 2 million. Followed by smaller communities in such countries as Belgium, Spain, the Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Austria. Some estimates indicate that Muslims will outnumber non-Muslims in Europe by the year 2050. This is a contentious point, but it's out there. In many of the major European cities, however, given the low birth rates of an indigenous non-Muslim populations, Muslim school children will be in the majority within the next decade. Now, the major waves of Muslim migration to Europe came after World War II, due in large part to labor immigration and a vestigial colonial connection. When their countries achieved independence, some, many, depending on what country and the conditions there, Muslims chose to emigrate. Professionals and skilled laborers from former European colonies in Africa, South Asia, and the Arab world sought a better life. But a significant difference between the European and the American experience can be seen in the 60s and 70s, and it affects the extent to which the majority of Muslims in Europe, in fact, come from an unskilled laborer background rather than the professional side. In the 1960s and 70s, unskilled laborers flooded into a Europe whose growing economies were in need of cheap labor and welcomed cheap labor. From the 1970s onward, increasing numbers of Muslim students came to Europe as they did to America to study as well. While many returned home, others for political and very much for economic reasons chose to stay. France has the largest Muslim population in Europe. It's 5 million Muslims, including more than 35,000 converts, accounts for almost 10% of the population. Most Muslims in France come from North Africa. Britain's 2 million Muslims come primarily from the Indian subcontinent, but increasingly from other parts of the world, from the Middle East, from North Africa. In contrast to Germany, where citizenship and the right to vote are more difficult to obtain, most Muslims in Britain, for example, come from British Commonwealth countries, and thus were able to enjoy British citizenship and full participation in political life as voters and as candidates. Indeed, some have been elected to political office and are members of the House of Lords and Parliament. Now, the issue of assimilation has been particularly acute in France, where after a long battle, the government has taken a firm stand on full integration rather than the multicultural approaches of Britain and America. So integration rather than multicultural approach. In a celebrated case, France outlawed the wearing of a headscarf or hijab by female students. Both France's Ministry of Education and its teachers' unions were united in claiming that the hijab violated France's secular constitution and traditions. They made no such argument with regard to Jewish students wearing a yarmulke or Christians wearing Christian chains or pendants. After several years of bitter debate, the French Constitutional Council ruled in October 1996 that despite the Education Ministry's ban, students could not be expelled, for indeed they had been. Students could not be expelled for wearing headscarves if no proselytizing occurred. At the heart of the French debate has been a tendency to see Islam as a foreign religion, placing it over and against its Judeo-Christian and very strong secular tradition, that is France's secular tradition. While the government has insisted upon a process of acculturation that left little room for a multicultural approach, many Muslims have argued that they should be allowed to develop a distinct French Muslim identity that blends established French principles and values with their Islamic faith and values. However different their experiences may be, Muslims in Europe and America have common concerns about practicing their faith, retaining Islamic identity, and preserving family life and values. Specific concerns include taking time out from work to pray daily, to attend mosque on Friday, to celebrate religious feasts, particularly the great Eids or festivals, the Eid al-Adha and the Eid al-Fitr. The availability of halal food, that is food that is carefully prepared or correctly slaughtered, analogous to kosher food within Judaism. The ability of that halal food or foods in schools or in the military or prisons. Now this increasingly is being addressed and has been addressed. And for those women who wish the right to wear a headscarf or hijab. Also the issue of a beard has come up with regard to some police forces and in other kinds of positions in these societies. Some request segregated athletics classes, are concerned about coeducation, sex education, and secularism in the school. And in some of these issues, they're not very different from those of conservative Christians and Jews, or many conservative Christians and Jews. I use the term conservative here in the broader sense. Others have supported the development of Islamic schools as a way to address these issues, as, for example, Catholics and Jews in the past did, to develop religious schools, so Islamic schools. Or, like a growing number of non-Muslim Americans, have turned to homeschooling, teaching their children at home. Living as a minority in a dominant culture that is often ignorant about Islam, or even hostile to it, many Muslims experience at times a sense of marginalization, alienation, and powerlessness. That's not to say that for many, there isn't a sense of fitting in, of being able to move forward, of being accepted. But for a minority, these problems exist. Some Muslims are further marked as different by their manner of dress. As I said before, particularly women who wear a veil, men who wear beards or skull caps or turbans, and they are sometimes singled out for harassment. In fact, think of the Sikh cab driver, a non-Muslim, who was murdered post 9/11, because whoever did it apparently thought that somehow he was a Muslim, because he saw a turban. This has increasingly been the case since September 11, 2001. Muslim experiences in Europe and America have been affected significantly by the actions of these militants, as well as by domestic issues. Thus, for example, in France, amidst growing unemployment, Jean-Marie Le Pen's right-wing National Front targeted Muslims, who had been welcomed during the period of economic expansion as a cheap foreign labor force. They became a convenient scapegoat, charged with stealing French jobs. Le Pen advocated the forced expulsion of 3 million immigrants, as well as priority for native French in jobs, housing, and welfare benefits. At the same time, many North Africans from Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria have entered France legally and illegally. The civil war in Algeria that we've talked about before caused many more Algerians to flee to France, swelling the ranks of its sizable North African population. After the Islamic Salvation Front in Algeria swept, remember, the first Algerian municipal elections and the parliamentary elections in the early 1990s, the military had stepped in, seized power, canceled the second round of parliamentary elections, denied the FIS their parliamentary victory, charging that Islamists were out to use elections to hijack democracy. In the ensuing spiral of violence and counter-violence, which claimed more than 100,000 lives, moderates became radicalized. Not all, but some. And new extremist groups like the Armed Islamic Group rose up, as well as extremist groups within the military, called the Eradicateurs. Bombings in Paris attributed to Algeria's radical Armed Islamic Group and post-9/11 concern about Al-Qaeda and the arrests of suspected terrorists have contributed to questions about Islam's compatibility with French culture, its Judeo-Christian or secular life, world, and whether Muslims could be true and loyal citizens of France. In America, the World Trade Center bombing of 1993 and the subsequent conviction of Sheikh Umar Abdurrahman and others for plotting other attacks in major urban areas like New York had raised serious questions about domestic terrorism. The attacks of 9/11, revelations about the presence of many of the attackers in America, the fact that they had lived in America, but also visited and lived in Europe, and the use of legislation like the Secret Evidence and Patriot Acts, and its continued use, and new measures being proposed for the Congress, and actions being proposed and taken by the FBI and other agencies, such as raising issues about the monitoring not of some mosques but all mosques, or the question of whether all Muslims should be monitored, the issue of profiling, indiscriminate profiling, have raised substantial questions, both within the Muslim community, but also among non-Muslims, about the future of civil liberties for Muslim Americans. Similar questions have been raised within Europe. So as we look at the Muslim experience in the West, in America and Europe, we can make some observations. Despite problems, Muslims, long regarded as other, are seen increasingly as now part of the fabric of American and European societies by many in our society. In America, they are more and more regarded by most as neighbors, co-workers, citizens, and believers. But we still have major problems. Some of the emails and letters that I get from some people, some of them claiming to be Christians or belonging to Christian groups, or the statements made by people like Pat Robertson and Franklin Graham, the statements that Islam is an evil religion, the failure to distinguish between Muslims extremists and mainstream Islam. Those create enormous problems for Muslims, and I think enormous problems within our own non-Muslim society. Muslims have increasingly, though, become more integrated into the American political process, both as individuals and organizations. A host of national and international organizations have been created to monitor and promote Muslim causes and interests. Among the more prominent are the American Muslim Council, the AMC, the Council for American Islamic Relations, CARE, the Muslim Public Affairs Council, MPAC, and the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy, CSID. We at the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown ran a major project called Muslims in the American Public Square, studying these issues in this role. However, issues of coexistence continue. First and foremost, the need to distinguish between the faith and practice of the majority of Muslims and the actions of a minority of religious extremists. Muslims and non-Muslims in the West face a common challenge of pluralism and tolerance. Too often in the past, tolerance has meant suffering the existence of others while regarding them as inferior. Today, all are challenged to embrace a modern form of pluralism and tolerance based upon mutual understanding and respect. To affirm the truth of one's own religion or worldview does not exclude the ability to acknowledge principles and values shared by others. Recognition of significant religious differences can still be accompanied by respect for the rights of others to hold different religious beliefs.
The future of Islam.
At the close of the 20th century, it appeared that the future of Islam could be one of new opportunities for peace, democracy, expanded human and women's rights, and political and social economic empowerment, and an increasing acceptance in Western societies of this notion of a Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition and of the presence of Muslims in our societies as full equal partners, as it were. 9/11 and the hijacking of Islam by militant extremists shattered the hope and the dreams of many Muslims throughout the world as they found themselves facing a new millennium in which the old stereotypes of Islam and Muslims as a violent religion and people to be feared and fought returned to center stage. Thus, the 21st century for Muslims will be a time not only for self-reflection, self-criticism, and internal reform, both religiously and politically, but also a time for educating, dialoguing with, and finding new ways in which to work with and within the West and global civilization. In the 21st century, Islam remains the fastest growing religion in many parts of the world and a significant factor in international politics. Thus, as we have seen, expanding our understanding of this global religion is important, if not critical. Our past lessons have focused on the dynamism and creativity that exist in the history and development of Islam. Let's think about it for a second. Muhammad's life and message brought religious and social reform to Arabia. And in subsequent centuries, Islam spread as faith, empire, and civilization. Islamic law, theology, and mysticism articulated the message and mission of Islam. Caliphs and sultans legitimated their rule and imperial designs in the name of religion. A world-class civilization emerged, encompassing philosophy, science, mathematics, medicine, art, and architecture. A rich legacy from Islamic civilization was appropriated by the West, or reappropriated, by a West that was emerging from a long dormant period of the Dark Ages. Although a dynamic faith and source for the development of vast regimes and rich civilizations in the past, in recent centuries, Islam seems stagnant, passive, of marginal concern and in decline, doomed to be overtaken by modernization and development. In the latter half of the 20th century, an Islamic resurgence, as we have seen, has challenged all expectations and predictions. However, this revitalization of Islam in Muslim life and society, that sometimes seems to be a radical revolution, is both a challenge and sometimes a threat to Muslim societies and the West. Despite its emergence as the second and third largest religion in Europe and America in the late 20th century, for many majority non-Muslim populations, the religion of Islam is still regarded as foreign to their Judeo-Christian and secular background. In recent centuries, as we've noted at a number of times in this course, Islam has been associated with underdevelopment, authoritarian regimes, religious extremism, and terrorism. And that includes today. Ethnic and cultural differences, and the Taliban, and Osama bin Laden, and Al-Qaeda have raised the specter of a particularly violence-prone religion and raised many issues about that. Yet, A Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition actually exists. As we have seen, despite significant differences, Islam shares many important similarities and linkages with the worldviews of Judaism and Christianity. From its belief in one God, its absolute monotheism, and acceptance of biblical prophets and revelation, to moral responsibility and accountability. However, relations among the children of Abraham have, from the 7th century to the present, been characterized both by competition and conflict, as well as by coexistence and cooperation. The impact of European colonialism, secular paths of modernization and westernization, chosen by many Muslim states, and the nature of authoritarian regimes, and consequent hold of tradition have stifled at times the pace of Islamic reform. Contemporary Islamic revivalism emerged in the latter half of the 20th century in many ways as a response in personal and public life to the failures of Muslim states and the excesses of westernization, or at least the perceived excesses of westernization. Religion became the dominant language and symbolism of political discourse in many Muslim societies, and remains so today. The impact of Islamic revivalism in its violent revolutionary forms, from Egypt and Iran to Afghanistan and Pakistan, has strengthened militant interpretations of Islam and proven a major obstacle to Islamic reform. In some Muslim societies, reformers are caught between a rock and a hard place, whether they're secular or religious reformers, between authoritarian regimes that will imprison and perhaps execute you, certainly torture you on the one hand, and a minority of extremists that will kill you if they don't like what you're saying. Militants have not only imposed their brand of Islam, but also silenced alternative voices. A struggle for the soul of Islam is being waged across the Muslim world and within Muslim societies. While many Muslims wish to simply return to and reappropriate and often romanticize, and in some cases reimagined past, others look to the past for inspiration in order to reinterpret, reform, and propel Islam further down the road in the 21st century. The struggle for an Islamic reformation in the 21st century is a battle in which lines are increasingly drawn between conservatives, fundamentalists, reformers. Muslim understanding and interpretation of Islam, attitudes towards change and modernization, reflect a broad religious diversity. And we've talked about it a few lessons ago, but at this juncture, as we look to the future of Islam, it's important to remember where we are today. Secularists, in light of the chaos and carnage at times caused by militants and Muslim extremists, re-emphasize that the future development of Muslim societies is contingent upon the separation of religion and politics. Many argue that after the death of Muhammad, religion, though used by rulers, was in fact separate from the state. Conservatives and traditionalists reaffirm the continued relevance of Islamic faith and traditions amidst rapid, predominantly Western-oriented change, whose secularism and material excesses they reject. Islamic reformers, an extension of early Islamic modernists, advocate an Islamic reformation. They don't always use this language, but a broad process of reform, a fresh reinterpretation or reconstruction of religious thought, and the transformation of Muslim societies, based upon a selective, and this word is important, a selective synthesis of aspects of Islamic and Western, as well as other cultures. Islamic activists, those who apply political and social activism, commonly referred to as fundamentalists or Islamists, maintain that reform is possible by returning to the sources of Islam, the Quran and Sunnah, example of the Prophet, to revitalize and reform Muslim societies. They are more critical of any form of dependency on or significant influence by the West, what they would see as Westernization, some call it West-toxification or Westomania. They are particularly sensitive to the penetration of Western culture and values, which of course go to the heart of a people's identity and faith, any people's identity and faith. Islamic movements and organizations span the spectrum, from mainstream organizations that operate within society, as we've seen, to extremists who rely on violence and terrorism. What we see today are challenges to the authority of the past. As with other religions, central to contemporary Islamic reform are issues of authority. The authority of Scripture, or more particularly, how Scripture and tradition are to be understood and interpreted. The authority of the ulama, the religious scholars. Tradition plays a major role in all the world's religions, and is especially sacrosanct in Islam, a primary source of Islamic law and of Muslim faith and belief. Think about the role of the traditions of the Prophet, for example. While the authority of the Quran remains paramount for all observant Muslims, for all the Quran is the final and complete Word of God, although they may differ in terms of their interpretation. So while it remains paramount, reminiscent of biblical criticism, although not exactly the same, but reminiscent of it, some scholars, more non-Muslim than Muslim, have raised substantive questions about the historicity of the Quran, Muhammad, and much of early Islamic history. However, the majority of scholars, while affirming the need for ongoing reassessment of scholarship in light of new information, would continue to affirm the essential historicity of the Prophet and the text of the Quran. Because Islam is the youngest of the Abrahamic faiths in terms of the establishment of the community, its historical issues are far less complicated than historical questions regarding, for example, early biblical prophets like Moses, David, and Saul. Non-Muslim and some Muslim scholars have also questioned the authenticity of many prophetic traditions. While some have questioned the authenticity of the bulk of the Hadith, most have not. Wherever one stands on this issue, at the very least, the Hadith are important, for they represent a glimpse of the early social history of the Muslim community, its issues, concerns, and responses. The voices of change are not restricted to the ulama, the traditional standard bearers of Islam. Increasingly, reformers are modern educated and Islamically oriented laymen and women who assert their competence to address issues as diverse as bioethics and medical ethics, birth control, abortion, cloning, gender relations, violence and religious extremism, democratization and pluralism. At the end of the 20th century, the future of Islam in the 21st century held the hope of a new millennium of globalization and opportunity. For many Muslims, certainly as a result of the early part of the 1990s, the Oslo Accords, there were dreams of peace in Palestine, increased democratization, and greater freedom in Muslim countries, and the growth and empowerment of Muslims in America and Europe, where Islam had emerged as a major religious presence. However, the lives, expectations, and dreams of many were shattered with the 9/11 terrorist attacks against the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. I, in fact, at that time, was writing a book called The Future of Islam, which I had to put on the back burner and instead address the issues of 9/11 in a book called Unholy War, Terror in the Name of Islam, and then one called What Everyone Needs to Know About Islam. And it's only now, and even tentatively, that I've returned to dealing with the subject of the future of Islam. 9/11 reinforced the voices of a clash of civilizations between peoples, so some said, who were diametrically opposed, who had diametrically opposed principles, values, and interests. How many of us remember after 9/11 when people said, why did this happen? The answer was, I don't know, or it's just a clash. They're completely different than we are. They don't like our democracy, our freedoms, our secularism, our capitalism. Within a matter of hours, a handful of terrorists transformed the 21st century from a century of great expectations to a world dominated by an American-led war against global terrorism. It reinforced the image of Islam and Muslims into a religion and a people to be feared and fought. Historically, religion has been and continues to be used and misused or abused. This is true for all religions. While religion is a source of transcendence, a transcendent God, a source of people being able to transcend themselves, historically, it has also had its dark side. And we've looked at part of that dark side. Religions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam that teach peace, the value of human life, moral accountability and responsibility, have been used to legitimate, as we've seen in the past and in recent times, holy wars, crusades, the slaughter of innocent people, whether we're talking about times past or more recently. Islam and Muslims continue to be plagued by questions in the wake of the impact of religious extremism in the Muslim world and the West. Among them are, is Islam a particularly violent, prone religion? One that educates and motivates terrorists to attack the West? Religion has been used by diverse governments and groups, secular and religious, mainstream and extremist, to legitimate their policies and or anti-Westernism. For example, more secular Arab socialist regimes in Egypt, Libya, Syria, and Iraq in the 1960s and early 1970s. In Pakistan, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, the father of Benazir Bhutto, used Islam to legitimate their socialisms and to criticize Western capitalism, as well as often to criticize the conservative monarchies of the Gulf. In the 1980s, self-styled Islamic governments in Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Sudan also appealed to Islam. Now, while many Islamic political and social organizations have worked, as we've seen, within the system, within the political and social system, extremists have also appealed to religion to legitimate their acts of violence and terror, to hijack their religion. For surely, whether they be Jews, Christians, or Muslims, when they use their faith to engage in clear acts of terrorism, they are hijacking the heartland of their religious tradition. The extent to which extremists have hijacked Islam was signaled tragically by September 11, 2001, by the attacks masterminded by Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. The hijacking of religion by extremists is not limited to Islam, but as we've seen earlier in this course, found in the history of most religious traditions. Extremists have used Christianity to justify slavery, the Ku Klux Klan, decades-long war between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland, Serbian genocide in Bosnia, the blowing up of abortion clinics. Jewish extremists have claimed religious legitimacy in the assassination of Israel's Prime Minister Rabin, or the slaughtering of Muslims at Friday prayer in the Hebrew Mosque in the 1990s, a mosque built on a site sacred to Muslims and Jews. Terrorists like bin Laden and others go beyond classical Islam's criteria for a just jihad and recognize no limits but their own, employing any weapons or means. They reject Islamic law's regulations regarding the goals and means of a valid jihad. For example, that violence must be proportional, that only the necessary amount of force should be used to repel the enemy, that innocent civilians, non-combatants, should not be targeted, and that jihad must be declared by the ruler or head of state, by a legitimate authority. Instead, someone like Osama bin Laden gives his own fatwa, even though formally he is not a mufti, with his own interpretation. Today, individuals and groups, religious and lay, seize the right to declare and legitimate unholy wars in the name of Islam. On the other hand, many Islamic scholars and religious leaders across the Muslim world, such as the Islamic Research Council at Al-Azhar University in Cairo, regarded by many as the highest moral authority in Islam, have made strong, authoritative declarations against bin Laden's initiatives, such as the following. Islam provides clear rules and ethical norms that forbid the killing of non-combatants, as well as women, children, and the elderly, and also forbids the pursuit of the enemy in defeat, the execution of those who surrender, the infliction of harm on prisoners of war, and the destruction of property that is not being used in the hostilities. What does Islam have to do with the fact that many Muslim countries are authoritarian, limit free speech, and have weak civil societies? The sources of authoritarianism have less to do with religion and more to do with the legacy of European colonialism and the nature of most modern Muslim states. Parenthetically, let's recall that while we think of Judaism and Christianity as accepting modern democracy and representing or reinforcing modern democracies today, in pre-modern times, they reinforced and supported divine right kingdoms and feudal systems. Upon achieving independence in the mid-20th century, Muslim governments were led by rulers who were kings, military, or ex-military, who turned to authoritarian rule and security forces to remain in power, not elections, and to assure their stability and security of their own governments. Many of these governments have had close ties with America and European powers, from Egypt, the Shah's Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, to Suharto's Indonesia. Is Islam incompatible with democracy, pluralism, and human rights? Islam in recent decades has been cited by a broad range of Muslims who believe it is incompatible with democracy, from the conservative monarchy of King Fahd of Saudi Arabia, who believes that it is not in line with Islamic traditions, to radical extremist organizations. At the same time, reformers have reinterpreted traditional Islamic beliefs and concepts. Ijtihad, the right to reinterpret. Shura, consultation. Ijma, consensus. Maslaha, the public welfare, general welfare. To support modern notions of popular political participation, pluralism, and human rights. Is Islam incompatible with capitalism? Now, historically, Islam is a religion that grew up in a commercially oriented society, has been intertwined with commerce and trade. The Prophet Muhammad, remember, was a successful businessman, as were many early Muslim leaders and scholars. The great mosques of Islam, such as the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, have extensive bazaars adjacent, selling every imaginable product. Among the major missionaries were the early traders and merchants who brought Islam to many parts of the world. Private property has always been recognized in Islam. Many of the ulama, the religious scholars, have been or come from business and land-owning families, marry into such families. In practice, capitalism has not been a religious stumbling block. Unfettered capitalism, capitalism without limits, and conspicuous consumption that are insensitive to issues of social justice do present a problem for religiously minded Muslims, as for religiously minded Jews and Christians and others. Many in the Muslim world, like many in other parts of the world, are concerned about the dark side of capitalism, the possible abuses of a free market economy, including the seeming lack of concern for the poor and weaker sectors of society. Others fear a globalization that will lead to greater Western economic penetration in Muslim countries, and the result, continued Muslim dependence on the West, and particularly a globalization that will lead through international communications to a greater cultural penetration of the West. Even the French are concerned about globalization and its and communications and its impact on French culture. Perhaps the best response to those asking if Islam and capitalism are compatible is to look at the lives of millions, hundreds of millions of Muslims who live and work in our midst in America, Europe, but also those in the Muslim world. But look at those in particular who've come to Europe and America. Why? To enjoy the freedom and opportunities offered by our economic and political system. Freedoms that they would want for their original countries. Is Islam a particularly misogynist religion? One of the major criticisms of Islam and Muslim societies involves the status and treatment of women. And we've talked about that a number of times. After 9/11, the plight of women under the Taliban, as well as their sisters in a number of other Muslim countries, some of those cited Saudi Arabia or Pakistan and elsewhere, have resulted in a powerful critique of Islam and a clarion call for change from some. Muslims in the 21st century do grapple with gender issues, often torn between advocates of sexual segregation and reformers who seek to redefine the roles of men and women. Increasingly, women are challenging the patriarchy of their Islamic tradition in mosques and societies, from Egypt and Iran to America, as they seek to carve out new paths in their quest for empowerment and liberation. As we've seen, the debate over the hijab, the headscarf, rages, and it rages and has raged not only in France, but in Muslim Turkey, where women have not been able to wear a headscarf who go to university. They've been turned away, or medical schools, or not even enter the parliament. Women parliamentarians have been denied the right to enter the parliament and be sworn in if they wear a headscarf. So that debate rages from Muslim Turkey and Tunisia to secular France and America. Critics continue to see the hijab as a symbol of oppression, of subservience to a male-dominated culture. Yet increasing numbers of women see the hijab as a symbol of freedom, as well as a bridge between their religious tradition and the realities of modern life. And so, for example, many young women in America and Europe, whose parents may not have worn the hijab, are taking the hijab, and we see them in our major universities, in our schools, in our societies. A primary area of substantial change is the status of Muslim minorities. There are more Muslim minority communities globally than at any time in history. In contrast to the past, most are permanent communities whose members have settled in other countries and will not be returning to their countries of birth. Substantial numbers of Muslims today live in a secular Europe and America, where they seek to preserve their faith and identity while accommodating life in Western societies. As religious and ethnic groups before them, Jews, Catholics, a variety of ethnic groups, they have had to struggle with a cross-section of issues. Among them, should the process be one of integration or assimilation? The extent to which their religion is compatible with living in a secular society. How to deal with and resolve conflicts between their Islamic and Western values. How to raise the next generation to be modern American, but also to hold on to their religious and indeed their cultural heritage. Post 9/11 has made the processes of adaptation and change more difficult, as Muslims face those who charge that Islam is incompatible with or a threat to Western societies. And it's compounded by legislation and policies that threaten the civil liberties of Muslims in America and in Europe. The agenda facing Islam in the 21st century is daunting. Unlike Judaism and Christianity, that had centuries to undergo their own processes of modern reform, Muslim societies have a far more telescoped, narrower window, narrower time frame. They do so responding not only to the realities within their societies and communities, but also to a Western-dominated world and era of globalization. This isn't like early Islam, when Muslims were in charge and expanding and therefore could borrow or not borrow. They were in charge of the process of change. They were the masters. The process of Islamic reform, as reform in Christianity and Judaism, is at times a religious battlefield. The Christian Reformation included bitter and divisive theological debates and religious wars between Catholics and Lutherans, etc. The theological and legal differences are reflected in the many Christian denominations. They're also reflected in Judaism in the range of orientations, including Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, and Reconstructionist Jews. Islam today is at a crossroads. Mainstream Muslims, from conservative to fundamentalists and liberal reformers, argue and debate. radical fundamentalists or extremists often engage in a holy war that pits Muslim against Muslim, as well as Muslim against non-Muslim. Despite setbacks for more than 14 centuries, Islam has proven vibrant and dynamic, growing spectacularly as a faith and empire from the time of the Prophet Muhammad. Islam's message and way of life has attracted followers of every race and culture, adapting to diverse cultures from Africa to Asia, Europe to America. Unity of faith has been accompanied by a diversity of expressions. In the 21st century, Islam, the second largest and among the fastest growing of the world's religions, faces yet another watershed as believers struggle to implement their faith and practice within the realities of contemporary life. Given the realities of recent history and the nature of many Muslim societies, the challenges are many. The struggle for reform will be religious, intellectual, spiritual, and moral, but it must be a more rapid and widespread program of Islamic renewal that not only builds on past reformers, but also more forcefully follows the lead of enlightened religious leaders and intellectuals, today more forcefully and more effectively, engaging in wide-ranging processes of reinterpretation and reform. Like those who have gone before, today's Muslims are guided by their belief in one God, one true God, the Quran, the example of the Prophet Muhammad, as they too seek to follow the straight path, the way of God to whom belongs all that is in the heavens and all that is in the earth, as the Quran in chapter 42, verses 52 to 53 states.